Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. David Lane. I'm professor of counseling at Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia, and was Dr. Connie Mitchell's major professor at Mercer University when she did her PhD in counselor education and supervision. And she asked me to record a brief talk. Hopefully, it won't be too long, and hopefully, you've all had a good cup of coffee and can stay awake for the next little bit. In case I start sounding like Ferris Bueller's teacher, I don't want to, but you never know when you're sitting looking at a computer. Usually, I'm up moving around and I'm talking with my hands and there's lots of energy. So it's tougher for me to sit at a computer and then look at the little camera and just talk at you for a while. I like to have interaction, but don't know how to do that with an asynchronous recording. Anyway, I'll do my best. Hope for the best with you, and hope for it to have meaning for you. So she asked me to talk about what makes counseling a separate and distinct profession from the other professions, such as psychology, psychiatry, social work, marriage, family therapy, any number of certifications, alcohol and drug addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And to do that, we got to back up just a little bit and take a look at some history. So I wanted to start with, and God said, "Let there be light." No. We probably don't need to start that early. We'll start 1870s with a guy named Wilhelm Wundt, Wilhelm Wundt. He was a professor at Leipzig University in Leipzig, Germany, and he started what some people argue as psychology as a separate, distinct field when he founded the first laboratory for psychological studies. He was studying perception, particularly perceptual field theory, which you'll have to look up. I'm not going to spend time here talking about it. But some people argue that that's the first separate and distinct evolutionary step of psychology as a separate and distinct profession. Prior to that, mental health had mostly been treated by the church, and the church treated it as demonic possession and mental illness as being possessed by demons, and there wasn't a lot of treatment. You've all heard of insane asylums, and the churches ran most of the asylums around, and there just wasn't a lot of care done. The treatment methods were very, very primitive. Mostly it was just warehousing folks and helping as best they could. And so this was the first step towards separating psychology, psychiatry, and the other disciplines from medicine, philosophy, religion, biological sciences, et cetera. And things some people argue that this was the first step toward that. Well, it's inarguable that in the 1880s, Freud and Adler began to take a look at psychiatric issues and more or less founded the field of psychiatry as separate and distinct from general medicine. They both happened to be neurologists. And they began getting cases that were referred to them by mainstream physicians who could find no medical cause for the things that they were seeing. And they both began to evolve theories wrapped around how our mind and body interplay, the effect that our emotions have on our physical state. And we know that nowadays there's heavy links between diseases and mental states, like a heavy link between cancer and chronic depression, heavy link between anxiety and poor diet, poor sleep habits, poor exercise habits. We all know it's intertwined nowadays. And so there's no argument, but they were laying the basis for that and began to talk about mental illness from a disease concept rather than demonic possession or other conceptual frameworks. And they started all of that in the 1880s and 1890s. Social work came along in the 1890s, and social work had as its origins working with folks in what were formerly called poorhouses in Chicago. There was a big place, and Ms. Jane Addams founded social work in Chicago, and they began to do things at this poorhouse in Chicago, and like putting the people to work in the house, helping them learn a trade, working with outside organizations, community organizations like construction crews and farms around in the community, and hotels around in the community. And so in the poorhouse, they would have the people, everybody had to work, and some of them worked doing laundry, some of them worked doing housekeeping. They had their own farm and animal stables and livestock, etc. Some of them worked taking care of the animals, some of them worked on the farm, all of which were marketable skills. And so social work had its roots in helping people learn vocations and coordinating with organizations and community organizations and other places for interventions for folks. And so they would bring them into the poorhouse, those folks who were homeless or who had lost their jobs, et cetera, and teach them a new trade, and then help them land a job at a hotel as a laundress, or hotel as housekeeping staff, in various restaurants as cooks, on farms and with construction crews, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the origins of social work. Counseling was a little bit different, and y'all probably already know this, but counseling started in the first decade of the 1900s of the 20th century, first decade. And it started as three separate and distinct disciplines. It started as school counseling because of inner city schools in Flint, Michigan, which were really, really struggling. And so they began to develop programs for vocational training and remediation and programs like that for the inner city Flint schools, because on the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of kids were essentially just feral kids. Mom and daddy were working 6 and 7 days, 10 and 12-hour shifts in factories and mills, and the kids were more or less just left at home to take care of themselves. An older sibling might sometimes try to take care of them, or they might leave several kids with a neighbor who was not working in the factory or the mill. But the displacement from the farms to the inner city had caused some urban problems that we still see the consequences of today, as a matter of fact. A lot of inner city struggles, and things have not changed tremendously since 115 years ago, when they began to recognize this need in Flint, Michigan. They were developing programs. That's the origins of school counseling. Then there was a second with Jesse Davis. I'm sorry, I left out Jesse Davis's name. He's considered the founder of school counseling in Flint, Michigan inner city schools. Then Jesse Parsons founded the Vocational Bureau of Boston Vocational Bureau, and he was actually a immigration attorney, oddly enough, to found a school of counseling, career vocational counseling. Frank Parsons considered the father, but he was actually an immigration attorney. And we had, throughout our history, we've had huge waves of immigration from the Irish in the middle 1800s to the Chinese, the late 1800s, the Italians in the early 20th century, and Russians around the Russian Revolution, lots and lots of waves of immigration. And the folks would come here seeking asylum, or because in the case of like the Irish, they came because there was a famine in England and they were starving to death by the thousands. And so they were seeking to get out, and they came to America, but they didn't have jobs. They didn't have connections here, anything like that. And so Frank Parsons began to develop ways of assessing people for job placement. In his job as an immigration attorney, he wound up working to help find people jobs, and created career vocational counseling as a byproduct. And he developed assessment methods that some variations of which are still used today, as a matter of fact. Then clinical mental health, what most of you are probably studying, was founded by Clifford Beers. And Clifford Beers was a well-educated, he was a Yale graduate, in fact, grew up in the Northeast in Connecticut. And he suffered with depression. He struggled off and on his whole life with depression. And he went into a psychiatric hospital, at the time called an insane asylum. Excuse me. And he spent 2 years, and he came out really no better off than he was when he went in. And he went in a second time and spent another couple of years in the hospital. And this in the early 1900s. And he came out, and this time he was better because he had determined, essentially, I'm going to get better. The institution didn't help him. But if you read his early works, A Mind That Found Itself is his foundational book. If you read his early works, it sounds a lot like CBT that he kind of worked on himself with cognitive behavioral therapy, where he challenged his own thinking, he challenged his own feelings, etc. But anyhow, he started the what came to be known as clinical mental health counseling or psychotherapeutic counseling, like more or less like we know it today. And he founded a counseling institute in Chicago that's still around and still operating and still seeing clients. A clinic in I said Chicago, that's not New Haven, Connecticut. And he founded this clinic there that's still around to this day. So these three counseling fields rocked along as separate disciplines of career vocational, school counseling, and mental health counseling. Well, counseling got a big boon in the 19-teens. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, and the United States was not going to get involved. But kind of for once, politicians did something right. It's a rare occurrence. It's like hen's teeth, so mark the date. It was 1914. And they said, we're not going to be involved in this, but what if we had to be at some point involved in this? How can we go? At that time, the standing Army, Navy, Marine Corps were about 40,000 people. We didn't have a huge military at that time. And they said, how can we go from this 40,000 that we have to enough personnel to fight a war effectively? And so they started, and then how could we do that? And then so they said, well, we could have a draft. And so they decided to implement a military draft in the 19-teens, just in case. Then they said, well, we're getting all these personnel in the doors. How do we figure out what job they are suited to do? Does anybody do any kind of assessment to figure out what job might fit a person best, or how to figure out what job to place a person in? And somebody raised their hand and said, there's a guy in Boston named Frank Parsons who could help us. And so they contacted the Boston Vocational Bureau and Frank Parsons in the 19-teens, and he developed for the military the Army Alpha. Later, he developed the Army Beta test, and now that test is known as the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, ASVAB, ASVAB. And it's still used today with its roots all the way back in 1914 in the Army Alpha, and a few years later, the Army Beta. And what it did was it was a vocational career assessment tool. So that counseling really got a boon and a real shot in the arm, particularly vocational counseling at that time when the government poured a bunch of money into it for assessment, personnel assessment, and contracted with various vocational career counselors to do assessment for Army personnel at induction centers. So counseling rocks along now for another 20 years. With school counseling creates a national certification in the 1920s. And then the 1930s, however, counseling emerged with its first model of counseling. It was called the Minnesota model, and it was developed at the counseling center at the University of Minnesota. And the way that it worked was a person would come into the counseling center at the University of Minnesota, and they would meet with a counselor who would do a ton of evaluations, do all kind of assessments, from career vocational to personality assessment, intelligence assessment, vocational aptitude stuff. And he developed this model in which the counselor was the expert, where the person came in, they completed the assessments, they came back, the counselor told them the results of all their assessment measures and the evaluations, and said, here's a plan for how to be successful. Here's what plan for what you ought to do. Here's a plan for how to work with your shortcomings and the things that you struggle with. So the counselor was the expert. Just like psychiatry, the counselor, the therapist was the expert. Psychology, the therapist was the expert. And social work, the social worker was the expert. And everybody bought into those models across the disciplines and practiced very similar models. Then things changed pretty dramatically in the 1940s in the person of Carl Rogers, who I hope you've all heard of by now. I shudder to think about your undergraduate education if you've not heard of Carl Rogers. But anyway, Carl Rogers kind of turned psychotherapy on its ear because he went counter to the whole paradigm of counseling and psychotherapy and psychiatry by advocating for the client or the person being the expert on his or her own life and not the counselor. And he advocated and pushed the idea that people are the best authorities on their own lives, and what the counselor's job is to help them understand and remove obstacles that have come into their lives and are creating stumbling blocks for them and causing difficulty for them. And our job as a counselor is to help them have insight, and through that insight, remove those obstacles from their lives. Well, it stuck. It hit fertile ground in all of the disciplines. And Carl Rogers is seen as one of the fathers of modern counseling, modern psychotherapy. All the disciplines claim him as one of the founding fathers of the discipline. So counseling in particular, going to focus on counseling now. Counseling changed radically in the 1940s with the client as the expert on their own life. 1948 was a significant landmark where all three professions came together: school, career vocational, and mental health counseling. They decided to form an organization which they founded and was chartered in 1952 as the American Personnel Guidance Association. APGA was the first, well, it wasn't the first, but it was the first unified counseling professional organization. And that's really important. The very first counseling organization was the National Vocational Guidance Association, founded in 1914, the NVGA, National Vocational Guidance Association. But all three disciplines came together in 1948. Took them a few years to put everything together and negotiate all the ins and outs. But in 1952, the APGA was founded. And it's important. I wish I'd be with you. I wish I could be with you and ask you, why is it important to have professional organizations? In counseling, in law, in medicine, they've all got professional organization. And why is that? But since I can't be with you, I got to give you the answer, but I hope you all are thinking about that. One of the key concepts of having a professional organization is to bring people with like minds and like interests together to work on. We have a wayward squirrel outside the window that must be tended to. All squirrels must die. Just in case you didn't know that, or if you didn't understand, that's just a basic law of nature. Anyway, back to the APGA and the importance of professional organizations. The professional organization provides an opportunity for those like minds to get together. They provide opportunities for dissemination of information, for the creation of ideas and dissemination of information through the professional organization. And a big thing that they did was in 1952, they started working on a code of ethics. And a code of ethics is important because professions need to be self-regulating. There's no authority, there's no governmental authority or church authority or anything that stands over us watching our actions and our practices, et cetera. And professional organizations are more or less supposed to do that. And they do that through codified codes of ethics, delineating appropriate and inappropriate behavior for the persons who sign on to the professional organization and agree to the professional organization standards. So that's one of the things that set counseling apart and defined it as a profession was the professional organizations and professional codes of ethics. Well, counseling keeps growing. In the 1950s, got another huge shot in the arm in 1958. 1957, the Russians launched the first man-made artificial satellite into space called Sputnik. Well, what that meant to the United States was we're behind technologically because we can't do that. We don't have the technology to do that. So in 1958, the government passed the National Defense Education Act and uh, poured money into development of that. They didn't call it STEM, but that's exactly what it was: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics uh, curriculums into colleges of education. And one of the things that they poured money into was counseling, school counseling in particular, because they wanted people to go into the elementary schools and assess people who were, when they were really young, for talent and potential in the STEM areas. Again, it was not called that in 1958, but in technology and mathematics and science. And so school counseling could go to school for free. All you had to do was write a letter to the NDAA authority. There was a place, and petition them to give you a grant to go to school, and they would pay for your master's degree and your doctoral degree as well. I knew some folks. Some of my professors had gotten their PhDs on NDEA money. So counseling has emerged, gotten big shots in the arm with the professional organizations, with the National Defense Education Act, and it emerges as a separate and distinct field then very clearly in the 1950s in particular. It's arguable that it goes back earlier than that, but for sure in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, though, they decided that we're going to kind of, sort of, create an amalgam of a Rogers model and our beliefs about counselors and who we are. And they begin to define counseling as a developmental profession. And what that means is that we see people who are struggling in some area of development in their life. Now, most of you can probably remember going through puberty, and that's difficult for everybody in some way, but for some people that's extremely difficult. All the changes, all the growth, all the development, everything that you go through during puberty, but for some people it creates really a big crisis for them. Teenage years, answering the big question of who am I and where am I going? What am I going to be? All of those things. Some people, they do okay with it. Everybody struggles a little bit, but some people, it just knocks them for a loop. Leaving home is another step that gives a lot of people problems. What am I going to do? Am I going to go to school? Am I going to go to work? Am I going to join the military? How do I define who I am or what I want to do? And that creates a tremendous amount of problems for people. Intimacy with another human being, whether I'm going to seek relationship or not, am I going to marry or not? That really creates struggles. Then getting married, having children, raising families, all of these are developmental transition points that can cause tremendous problems for people. And that's when we see people. We see people who are struggling with questions of teenagehood. We see people who are struggling in their marriage because they can't seem to figure out the intricacies of it and iron out the wrinkles without significant struggle. And so they're having a tremendous amount of difficulty. We see people who are having kids and they're struggling, trying to rear their kids. And we see the kids whose parents are struggling to try and figure out how to make it manage. But what makes them different from how what makes it different how we treat them from psychiatry and psychology is we see those things as normal. We think most people that we see, aside from organic illnesses like schizophrenia, true bipolar illness, autistic spectrum disorder, those kind of things, neurologically based, chemistry based disorders, that's a medical illness. But the folks that we see with behavioral and emotional struggles are typically people who are trying maladaptive ways to get a legitimate need met. They're doing what they know to do, but and it worked for them when they were 6 years old or 8 years old. But now that they're 20 or 30 or 40 years old, those 8-year-old defense mechanisms don't work really well. And now they're creating problems. But these folks are normal given their context. So counseling views people as normal versus psychiatry, psychology, who view people as ill and medically disordered. So the lens of pathology is laid on top of the other professions. And counseling, we have a wellness focus. We have an emphasis on normalcy. We have an emphasis on the client being the expert in their life versus the medical model of psychiatry and psychology and social work have the model of pathology and the counselor therapist being the expert on the illness or the struggle that the person's having. And it's always illness based, it's pathology based. You think about psychologists, what they do, majority of what they do is they assess for disorder. They assess for disability, i.e., they assess for things that are wrong with you. They assess for pathology. Counselors don't do that. We do some assessment. Yeah, we have to live in the real world where insurance requires us to diagnose it if we're going to work in a practice or in a hospital or residential treatment center. Yeah, we have to do that. But our model is one of wellness. Our model is one of health. Our model is one of normalcy. Our model is one of the client being the expert in their own lives versus me, somebody who doesn't know them from Adam, really being the expert in their life. Well, we're just not. If we view people in context, we can frequently see that most of their struggles are maladaptive attempts to get a legitimate need met. Let me give you a couple of examples. I was running an inpatient treatment program one time in child and adolescent program. I worked 14 years in child and adolescent hospital residential care before I finished the PhD and went primarily to teaching. But most of my experience was with children, teenagers, and families. And a kid was brought into the hospital by the police for a psychiatric evaluation. And he had been caught trying to steal a car. So I did the intake. I just happened to do the intake on that one. And I sat down with the mom and I got the family history. And I found out that both grandfathers, and two uncles were all in prison for running a stolen car ring. Now, what's wrong with this kid? The answer is nothing's wrong with this kid. Let me shift the paradigm for you a bit. The mom comes in and tells me this kid had gotten caught working in a hardware store. And I found out that both granddads and two uncles all ran a hardware store and worked in a hardware store together. What would be wrong with the kid working in a hardware store? Now understand, he's trying to steal a car. It's against the law. Not arguing that. That's not the point. The point is the kid was doing what he knew. He was essentially going into the family business. And is that not the American dream? So what this kid doesn't need medication. This kid doesn't need to be assessed into a coma to determine what all is broken in him. What this kid needs is another worldview. And so my job as a counselor becomes to teach him that he has learned this one worldview from where he came from, but there are many other worldviews and ways of operating in the world that he does not know about and he doesn't understand. And once he does, perhaps he can make other decisions. But right now he doesn't know that. So my counseling developmental perspective, my wellness perspective, assessed him as, in his context, being relatively normal and trying to do what he knew best. You find women, this is another example, women who are abused as children grow up and marry abusers. Now, on the surface of it, that seems weird, doesn't it? You would think that a woman who had been abused as a child could recognize the potential for abuse. You might guess that a woman who was abused as a child could grow up and recognize an alcoholic, but they marry alcoholics, they marry abusers in vast numbers. These statistics are really clear. Are these women sick? Are they pathological? Do they need to be on 9 different medications for some mental illness? I would contend that they don't. I would contend that this is what they know, given their context, given their history, given their perspective. This is what they know, so this is what they continue to choose. And I think we all do that. We all do this to a certain extent, from little bitty things like, I like Peter Pan peanut butter. I continue to choose Peter Pan peanut butter because it's good. It's familiar. I'll eat Jif if that's all there is. Hey, put Kroger in front. I'll eat that if that's all there is. But given a choice, I'm going to pursue Peter Pan peanut butter. And I know that's silly. That's a silly little example. But what we know and what feels right to us, what feels best to us, is what we pursue. And if that's all they know, then that's what they pursue. And from a model of wellness, you can understand that they are just pursuing what they know, given their context, given their maladaptive attempts at achieving a legitimate emotional need, such as loving and feeling loved. This feels like love to them. This is all love has ever been, and that's what it feels like to them. So my job as a counselor is not to get them to a psychiatrist as quick as I can, to get them on the 19 different medications. My job is to help them have another worldview, help them understand the agency that they do already have in their life, and help them learn how to make different choices. So what separates counseling from other mental health disciplines and mental health professionals is our wellness model. We resist the idea of pathology. We resist the idea of mental illness. We resist the idea of people being broken and there's something wrong with them. We resist that, and we view them in context, and we find ways to help them be well and use strengths that they already have, and develop those strengths and have a different way of looking at the world and pursuing appropriate ways to meet legitimate needs. So, and to contrast that, medical model, psychiatry, psychology, social work, view things from a perspective of pathology. So that's my nickel's worth. I hope that it has been beneficial for you. I hope that it has a meaning for you. Dr. Mitchell can, if y'all got any questions or anything like that, she's wonderful. She acts, but she's wonderful. Don't ever let her tell you she's not wonderful and just incredible. So she can answer all the questions that you have. But if anything comes up, I'm sure she can get me any questions or anything, and I'm happy to answer them for you. So I hope that was beneficial. Hope it's meaningful to you. That's always my prayer, that I can make a contribution somewhere along the line. And I appreciate her asking me to do it. It's always flattering for that to happen. And I appreciate y'all's attention for the last half hour or so. Take care. Hope to meet you one day. Bye-bye.